Hola, scholars. Today we are looking at racial formation in the United States. Specifically, we are looking at pages 1 through 51, which is the introduction to the book, Introduction to Racial Formation in the United States, and then chapter 1 on ethnicity. Now, there's an older version of this textbook that I want to actually discourage you from using because it's very outdated. I have a copy of it, and if you need to reference it, we could try to align the pages, but this version is really the more comprehensive text. So please refer to this one. I'm just going to walk you through a couple of key points to note as you're reading with some explanations. So starting on Introduction, Racial Formation in the United States, on page 1, I think it's a fun way to begin, especially considering chapter 1 gets really in depth with sociological terms and ideas on ethnicity. Can get really dense. So the mic check, as they describe on page 1 at the top, is a call out, a demand that new attention be paid to the deepening crisis of race and racism in the contemporary United States. So the authors of this textbook have updated it from that older version that I showed you, and they're saying that race is still something we need to talk about. Racism is still something we need to talk about. And they speak a little bit about this idea of a post-racial society. So we have moved beyond needing to talk about race. Everyone's equal. We all treat each other as humans. We all bleed red blood, so to speak. And that with the election of Obama that occurred, that it's not an issue anymore. And they say, no, it still is. And there's a really good quote at the bottom of page 1 from Malcolm X, in which he says, Malcolm countered that it did not show improvement to stick a knife 9 inches into someone, pull it out 6 inches, and call it progress. But some people, Malcolm observed, don't even want to admit that the knife is there. So the knife, they explain, is the wound of racial disadvantage and dispossession, and that it's ignored today. So within our structures of society, there's some groups that receive more privileges than others, and it's built in because of racism that has been part of our nation since its very beginning. And they talk about empirical studies on healthcare access, educational opportunity, and incarceration rates that show these inequalities along a racial lines. And so as you continue reading the introduction, I'd like to point you out on page 2. At the top, there's some examples of the structural issues that show the distribution of economic wealth is not equal across racial lines. Then if you go a little further down into the second paragraph, they talk about individuality in terms of race and racial discrimination. It has to do with one person acting in bad faith rather than a system. And then I think that the third paragraph, they had some really good questions. It says, but can anyone in the contemporary United States really ever forget race? Can we actually suspend how we immediately see and read people with whom we come into contact? Can we avoid categorizing people into existing racial categories? And then I think it's really important to understand with this introduction is race is not static. It changes depending upon its historical time period and who was discussing it in whatever study. And to get a really good idea of race, means to understand history. So the book, there's a little mini summary of what the book contains on page 3, and actually they do a further explanation of what you can expect in the different chapters later on page 10. So if you want to really see the makeup of the chapters and very short summaries, start on page 10 and go through page 16 in the introduction. But with that being said, racial theory and how racism started is discussed on page 3. And basically one dominant group requiring a nation state and building this idea based on their dominance, which happens to have really been white settlers, slave owners, in our history at least. And then a subjugated group, having to come back after having been owned or abused. Race, as discussed the first week of class, is a social construction. So it's something that we explain in terms of how we read someone, but these ideas of biological differences that are the same across all groups based on biology is not true. The human genome is 99.9%, something like that, like the same across humans. So racial differences is what we perceive in terms of how those genomes present in different bodies. So if you continue on with the introduction, it talks a little bit about race and its role in social science as a discipline, very specifically sociology, anthropology, psychology, cultural anthropology. And they give you an idea of the trajectory of racial politics and how even within these disciplines, there were groups that wanted to talk about race and groups that didn't really want to talk about race. They speak on page 6 about the Chicago School of Sociology and that it was pioneering Black efforts within the field because a lot of the Black sociologists were not included in the discipline and educational and different kinds of studies. So they kind of created their own, trajectory with different scholars that led those efforts, one being Robert E. Park. And then the conclusion of this introduction, outside of the chapter summaries, is really just about a quick cursory understanding or glance of American history and race history in the U.S. So, and that's discussed at the bottom of the first paragraph in page 8. Native Americans faced removal and genocide. Blacks were subjected to racial slavery and Jim Crow. Latinos were invaded and colonized, and Asians faced exclusion. So that's a very generic understanding of the different groups and what they were going through. And although we did have the civil rights movement and laws that went into effect to give voting rights and opportunities to people of color, that there was still massive inequalities and access to these rights. So, and then like I said, on page 10 onward, it's really just a summary of each chapter. So this brings us to part 1, Paradigms of Race, Ethnicity, Class, and Nation. And we're going to look specifically at chapter 1, Ethnicity. It looks like this, and it starts on page 21. And this is really talking about that word ethnicity and something in sociological kind of terms called ethnicity-based theories of racism, and whether we can use those to understand what's going on in terms of where we were and where we're going with these race topics. And really, it's about its shortcomings, right? This is why we have an ethnic studies class that you take rather than just a sociology class on race. Not saying that there's anything wrong with that, but there's something deeper that we're going to be doing in an ethnic studies class. And so race as a matter of ethnicity, it's discussed with a definition at the top of page 22. It's the first full paragraph. To treat race as a matter of ethnicity is to understand it in terms of culture. It is to undermine the significance of corporeal markers of identity and difference, and to even downplay questions of descent, kinship, and ancestry, the most fundamental demarcations in anthropology. So culture is about all of the practices that we might do where we celebrate a certain way, where we listen to certain music or eat certain foods, and it relies less on the physical demarcations that might be associated with the community or this notion of familial kinship, family descent, knowing family histories that are passed on from generation to generation as a way to explain who we are as a people. So it's very different, this ethnicity theory. And ethnicity theory has been very incorporated, very complementary in terms of U.S. history and American identity formation. On that same page at the bottom of 22, they talk about Americans viewing race as a cultural phenomenon in terms of hyphenated Americans, Mexican-American, Asian-American, making it be reduced to beliefs, religion, maybe language, less about the lived experiences that a group might have. And when you do it that way, it encourages this notion of assimilation, in which one group kind of gives up a lot of its practices in order to, quote, fit in with the dominant group. And that is very popular with this paradigm of race if we're looking at this ethnicity paradigm. So if you continue on, page 23 talks about the dominant racial group, in which it was started with, if we go way back to the Puritans, who came over to what was to become the United States to escape religious persecution. They kind of started this idea of a white body, of a certain type of group that was, quote, considered superior. That's talked a little bit in the Du Bois quote here in the center of 23, and then in that bottom paragraph. Assimilation more is talked about again on page 24, and about how you can become white on page 25. And so that's talked about, especially in that big chunk paragraph at the bottom of 25 that starts with, after 1877, the U.S. color line started to be inscribed around Europe rather than through it. And so this is when you have Italian Americans, Irish Americans immigrating to the U.S. and, quote, becoming white, even though initially when they immigrated, they were considered at the same level as a Black American, right? And how do you become white in this country as a new immigrant? So that's discussed on page 25. We go on to talk a little bit about culture contact, cultural pluralism on page 26. And then remember that Chicago sociology school I was talking a little bit about? Well, you're going to get into some really in-depth understandings about a lot of the Black sociologists that were working in that school of thought on page 27. And so that goes on all the way until 29. And there's a lot of these ideas in terms of names that are being dropped, and then another kind of concept called the default to whiteness. And so then at the bottom of page 29, again, there's some really great questions that are asked. It's before ascent to dominance. We know what a racialized body is, but what is an ethnicized body? Were the historical experiences that people of color encountered similar to those of white Europeans? Were the trajectories for their perceived eventual incorporation and assimilation the same? To these questions, ethnicity theorists generally answered yes, but many anti-racist activists and movement groups, though, begged to differ. So they're saying that a racialized body experienced things differently than ethnicized body, one that was reliant on ethnicity rather than race. Okay, so as we continue on in this chapter, I think it's really great to talk about this notion of immigration, because ethnicity theory is really tied to an idea of people coming to the U.S. and sharing their culture and assimilating into the dominant culture of U.S. Ideologies. So that's talked about on page 30 and 31. You read a little bit about Black, quote, immigrants who were never immigrants. They were forcibly removed from their countries in Africa, the continent of Africa, and forced into slavery to come over here. So it wasn't free will or choice that was given to them. And then, the immigrant ideology comes into play with that group later, after slavery has been abolished or is becoming abolished, and you have this delineation between the North and the South, and you have Southern Blacks immigrating north for more rights. And so that's where the immigrant ideology around a Black population comes in. They talk a little bit about the Bracero program on page 31, with different Mexican Americans coming over, or different Mexican citizens coming over to work during World War II, and yet they weren't considered citizens. So there's some complications here. Read page 30 and 31 pretty closely. Assimilation, again, and especially of the Black community, is talked a lot on page 32. And then as you continue on, 34 through 36 is really a lot about racial studies that are being done by different scholars. So you're going to be seeing some names like Murdahl and Robert Merton and Parson, and a really famous person, they're all famous, but a really well-known individual, Kenneth B. Clark. That's discussed on 35. And him and his wife, Mammy Phipps Clark, were the ones that did the doll test that was used in the Supreme Court 1954 case with Brown versus Board of Education. So that's talked about on 35 and 36. There's another theory talked about called, quote, Beyond the Melting Pot. It's an article that some of these scholars wrote. So really, as you're hitting 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, it's all examples of this ethnicity paradigm and how it's being used to change law, and its positive improvements, but also its restrictions. So they're really giving you a breadth of the history of these studies that are being done. So you don't need to know them all, but it's good to kind of skim those pages to understand them. And really, the racial identity coming up during the civil rights movement, when laws are being made, but we're still seeing inequities with these laws. And so then you have the Black Power movement, you have the Brown Power movement, the Yellow Power movement, you have the racialized groups now saying, you know what, we're going to claim our racial identity and be empowered by that claiming. So it's countering this notion of ethnicity. And we'll talk about this more in class. So then in the final pages of this chapter on ethnicity, what I was just talking about with the kind of racial movements and claiming racial identity, that's again talked a little bit about on page 41 in the first full paragraph, with the Black Power movement, the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, the American Indian movement, Partido de la Raza Unidad, all these different groups that are using their racial power to change political landscapes, right? And then as you finish up, there is a final kind of ethnicity-based neoconservative approach that the authors analyze starting on page 42 until the end of the text up to page 46. And it's a three kind of process or attempt to reduce race to an element of ethnicity. So number one, they call the bootstrap model. So the reason that some groups make it, and they quote, pull themselves up by their bootstraps, is because they're hardworking. They deserved it. They assimilated. And if there's a group that can't make it, it's because something's wrong with them, with their culture, with their ethnicity. So that example is talked about on page 43 at the bottom of that first full paragraph. If, quote, Chicanas don't do well in school, this cannot even hypothetically be due to low quality education. Instead, it has to do with Chicana and Chicano values. After all, if Jews and Japanese Americans did well in inferior schools, why can't other groups, right? So there's this notion of the reason it didn't work, that bootstrap model, it resides in an individual / cultural perspective on that group. The second part is they all look alike. That's discussed on page 44. So it's when groups of people are considered the same type based on how they're looking. So even though we know a Black community is very diverse, and that doesn't mean everybody that might appear Black is, quote, African American or from a specific country in Africa. They could be Afro-Latino. There's a big diversity, right? So when you reduce everyone to looking alike, we sometimes get that in a Latino community where a group of people can be reduced to as all Mexicans or all Mexican Americans, even though there's quite a diversity in terms of what Latin American countries people are from. And so what does that mean when you, quote, group everyone basing on this idea of them all being the same in terms of look? And then finally, the third one was discussed on page 45, once is not enough, which is this idea of being granted whiteness status, that it happens and certain groups make it, but why can't all groups make it? Why is once not enough? And then the chapter ends. There's a lot of footnotes on page 46 onward to 51. I really recommend you look at some of these footnotes. There's some really interesting notations and additional research you can do. The key summary after you finish this chapter on ethnicity is as follows. It's the very last sentence or two here in the chapter on 46. Being, quote, ethnic turns out to be about whether and how much an individual or group can assimilate into or hybridize with whiteness. Being, quote, racial is about how much difference there is between an individual or a group and their white counterparts. So we'll talk more about this in class. Please bring any questions or email me on Canvas. I know it was kind of a longer lecture video. I'll try to put up some chapter headings to make it easier to browse it. Thank you.